All right, so today we are going to learn about cum clauses. And the biggest takeaway about cum clauses that I want you to have is that cum can be translated as when, since, or although when it introduces a subordinate clause in Latin. Before I go any further, though, I want to pause and just recognize that some of the examples from this book and some of the descriptions of certain types of cum clauses have been adapted from Frederick M. Wheelock and Richard Lafleur's Wheelock Latin 7th edition textbook. Back to the task at hand, though. Even though this basic rule should be pretty simple to get down, I want us to look a little bit deeper into the whole concept of cum clauses in order to gain a little bit more of a fuller understanding of them. So let's get moving. So what we're used to seeing cum as prior to this was as a preposition, which is slightly different, right? We saw it as a preposition with the ablative that had two usages, ablative of accompaniment and ablative of manner. And ablative of accompaniment being I walk with my friend to school, ablative of manner being the soldiers fought with great courage. However, we're now learning a new usage of cum, where it largely comes at the beginning of a sentence, but it certainly comes at the beginning of a clause, a subordinate clause, where it can have three meanings, when, since, or although, and the verb that follows it will either be indicative or subjunctive. When is it indicative? When is it subjunctive? Well, that's what we're going to look at now. Okay, and it depends on what type of cum clause it is. Is it temporal, circumstantial? Is it causal, or is it concessive? With the corresponding meanings listed for each of these usages listed on the left-hand side. And so let's dive in. And we're going to start by looking at that first example right there, temporal circumstantial clauses, where we translate cum as when. All right, so the temporal usage of cum, as it lists below, it says, right, we're going to talk about when the main clause event occurred, and in situations where the only information being provided is when that event occurred relative to your subordinate clause action. So to put this into example format, to make it less abstract, when Titus was emperor, Vesuvius erupted. Titus being emperor in no way had any bearing on Vesuvius erupting. It's just telling us Titus, the time when Vesuvius erupted, right? By giving us some relation, right? Titus was emperor, Vesuvius erupted. These things coexisted at the same time. Okay? So now let's look at circumstantial, which is going to have a little bit more of a relationship between the cum clause part, when Titus was emperor, right, and the main clause, Vesuvius erupted. Circumstantial. All right, so as I listed here, right, there's a bit more of a connection. It's more, the cum clause is describing more of the surrounding circumstances, linked to the main clause event, and the verb is going to be in the indicative for the present and future, but in the subjunctive for the past. That this is the verb in the cum clause. So an example is when we are afraid, we ask for help. Right? It's telling us when we ask for help, but it's also giving us a little more of a linkage, right? It's telling us a little bit like, oh, well, I can kind of see a connection between asking for help and being afraid. The next point right there, when I was speaking, the students became sleepy. It's telling you when the students became sleepy, but there's also slightly more of a connection than just purely this happened at the same time as this other action. Okay, does that give you a little bit more of a sense? So just to be clear, when the verb is temporal, when the usage is temporal, the verb in the cum clause is always indicative. When the cum clause is expressing more circumstantial, a circumstantial event, the verb in the cum clause can be either indicative or subjunctive. And let's just look at a slide that sort of summarizes this in a more visual format. So as we notice, the key takeaway here is that when the subordinate clause tense, when the tense of the verb following cum is present or future, and we think we want to translate cum as when, we know that the verb that follows it will always be indicative. However, when that verb is in the past tense, we sometimes will see it in the indicative if the linkage between the subordinate and main clause only has to do with time, whereas we will more frequently see cum, meaning when, with a past tense verb, that verb will be in the subjunctive, and it will generally be because that verb will have more, that action will have more than just a time linkage to the main clause. So this is a lot of abstract ideas. It might be confusing, but I think trying it out with a couple of practice sentences might help clear things up. So let's take a look at those. Before I move on, I just want to emphasize here that when cum is followed by the pluperfect subjunctive, we translate cum as after. After we had read the book, we knew the ending. Okay, let's move on and look at some examples. When we listen closely, we learn. So what would be the mood and tense of we listen? Present indicative, right? Because when we know that whenever the verb is in the present tense, whether the usage is more temporal or circumstantial, we know we're going to translate that verb as indicative, always in the present or future tense. With number 2, we're going to translate when the Caesar, I should just say when Caesar, apologies for that, when Caesar was in Gaul, there was a flood in Egypt, because when Caesar was in Gaul is in the past tense, we have to decide, well, is this going to be subjunctive or is it going to be indicative? And I would suggest that it should be in the indicative, because there's no real connection between Caesar being in Gaul and there being a flood in Egypt. It's just telling us more time about the flood in Egypt. When did the flood in Egypt occur? Oh, it occurred at the same time as Caesar was in Gaul. So does that make sense? So we use the indicative because it's purely temporal. For 3, when Catullus was writing poems, all of Rome felt more romantic. Your boy Catullus. That would be circumstantial, because there is a little bit of a connection, right, between Catullus's romance poetry and Rome feeling more romantic, and so that's more circumstantial, and we translate was as the subjunctive, was writing as the imperfect subjunctive. And then 4, after Catullus had seen Lesbia, he thought of no one else. Very sweet. You can see, hopefully clearly there, going back to the nota bene on the previous slide, that we're going to translate had seen as the pluperfect subjunctive. All right, so we're now going to move on to the next slide. All right, so I'll write these up for you real quick. Present indicative, imperfect indicative, because it's temporal, and we're going to say this is circumstantial imperfect subjunctive, and this is pluperfect subjunctive circumstantial usage. All right, good. Moving on. So we're going to switch off to the other meaning of cum, since, for the causal usage of cum. As the name implies, a cum clause that is causal is explaining the cause of the main clause action. And so when we translate cum as since, some simple examples are: since you know help is being brought, these evils can be endured with courage. And again, since they offer us money, we shall offer them aid, right? If since here is represented by cum, you could translate the rest of the sentence and say, well, I think that this clause is really telling me a cause of this main action. Why can evils be endured with courage? Because help is being brought. Same here. Why are we going to offer them aid? Because they offer us money. Okay, so you can sometimes with cum clauses, it's best to translate the rest of the sentence, plug in maybe a when, a since, or although as a guess, and then go back and see which one sounds the best after you finish translating it. Does that make sense? All right, let's move on to cum clauses, the final type, although concessive. Again, just like with the causal, when we translate cum as although, just as when we translate it as since, the verb in the cum clause is always going to be subjunctive. No more difficult decisions between, should I make it indicative, should I make it subjunctive? It will always be subjunctive. No worries there. Another good way to recognize a concessive usage of cum is that the main clause will often have tamen, just like in English, because tamen means, just like concessive clauses in English, because tamen means still, nevertheless. So I say, although I did this, I still didn't mean it. That's not a great example. I'll stick to the ones I have here. Although he knew this, he still sent soldiers. As you can see, the cum clause, him knowing this, you might have expected, assuming that this is like maybe he knew there was a trap, you might have expected him not to send the soldiers, but the main clause is saying he still did it. So a concessive clause is where the cum clause action seems to contradict the eventual action of the main clause. And that's how you know to translate cum as although rather than since or when. And again, although they were afraid, they still marched onwards. Right? You might have expected, because they're afraid, that they would stop going forward, but in fact they did. So again, the cum clause action of them being afraid seems to contradict the main clause action of them marching onwards. And so we know to translate the cum as although. All right, so again, a lot of kind of abstract sounding terminology. So let's just end on a simpler note. When you see a cum introducing a subordinate clause, and the best way to identify it is that if it's not followed immediately by an ablative noun, or it comes at the beginning of the sentence, right? Then we're going to translate that cum as when, sometimes after, but really when, since, although. And we're going to link cum, when, since, although, cum, when, since, although in our minds. And we're going to use context to decide which of those translations to use. Should we use when? Should we use since? Should we use although? We're just going to try one of them, plug it in, and then at the end of the sentence, after we've come to a better understanding of the sentence, we'll go back and be like, well, maybe it'll be smoother in English to replace cum here with since, or maybe we're better to replace it with when. As a nice cheap shortcut, if the verb following the cum clause is in the indicative, we know that it's going to be translated as when, right? Because since and although cum translations are always followed by the subjunctive. Okay? So again, really, you could just look at this slide and be able to translate most cum clauses fine. The other slides are mainly just to dive into the weeds a little bit and give you a bit more sense of the formatting of cum clauses. Okay, hope this helps. We can look at more examples next class.